learned to use over the past couple of years. And we've learned to do this as educators because of the increasing importance of generative AI in our work as professionals, but also in our professional lives. Many of us use generative AI for a wide variety of purposes, those being not only associated with our professional role, but also in other tasks that we might be doing in our personal lives. And as English language educators, we are obviously responsible for enabling our learners to be well prepared for current demands, current challenges, and also future ones and future needs. And as English language educators, I believe we're not just responsible for focusing on competencies that are directly related to the English language, but we can use our English language teaching as a vehicle for the teaching of a wider variety of competencies. And this is one such competency that has become increasingly important with the advent of certain large language models that have become highly significant in education and in a broad array of realms. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can be more effective in terms of our ability to interact with large language models, to communicate and to collaborate with machines so that what we do as educators and what we enable our students to do in the current roles, but also in the future jobs, is far more efficient. And this talk is also meant to be practical in the sense that when I will be talking about the different kinds of prompt methodologies that we can engage in, I'll be showing you some examples and enabling you to reflect on how we can actually implement these methodologies. But I've mentioned that AI has become more and more important and is likely to be even more important to us in the coming years. But this doesn't mean that there aren't any downsides to it. In fact, current research shows us that there are certain issues that we need to be aware of when using this kind of technology, because there are potential effects, negative effects that it might have on us as users of the technology, but also as professionals and as learners. The first one is that some people lack a knowledge of how AI works and how it could best be used. And this insufficient knowledge can ultimately affect their interaction with the technology, and it can also harm the use of the technology, or what ends up being the output of that particular use. So developing an understanding of how these large language models work and what constraints they might have is highly important as a first step in enabling us to engage in a more effective relationship with machines. In fact, research also indicates that some people, and I'm not just referring to people my age or older, but even younger people, are sometimes lacking in an awareness of the dangers of misusing AI or its limitations. So that lack of awareness is also problematic, and it forms part of something that I'm going to be talking about very soon. One thing that I see amongst my own students, I teach at a university, and one thing that I see happening quite often amongst my students is that they use the technology. They might have learned how to use it to ultimately make better use of their time, but they are using it in an uncritical manner. So they are not deploying the critical thinking when using the technology. And they are also delegating the cognitive work that they used to do before to the technology, to the extent that now there is this complete reliance on the technology for a wide variety of tasks, without really questioning the output that is generated by the AI. And this ultimately has an impact on learning and retention. So here, when we are delegating most of the cognitive work, the cognitive load to the AI, what's happening is that learning is not really occurring in an efficient manner. And this is highly problematic. Now, it might be an evolution of the way we learn and the way we retain information and the way we employ information for a wide variety of tasks, but it is certainly an issue when we use the AI as a crutch to do almost everything for us without us really needing to employ our analytical thinking, our creative thinking, and our critical thinking. Another issue that I often see amongst my own students is this misconception that generative AI is a truth generator, that whatever you ask the technology, it is always going to give you something reliable and trustworthy. In reality, what we need to understand is that these are statistical machines and they have their limitations. And here on the screen, I've listed a few of these limitations. We've all heard of AI hallucinations, of how, when, for example, a student is producing an assignment and it asks the student to incorporate citations to scholarly work within the assignment, if we don't bother to check whether those citations actually exist, we might very well submit an assignment that incorporates hallucinations, that is, references and citations that do not exist. And this happens to quite a few of my students. Another issue that we're talking about quite a lot nowadays is how these large language models were trained on specific kind of data. And most often, what's happening is that there is a misrepresentation of reality, or else at least there is a biased perception of reality. And that's why the acronym WEIRD was invented. It was invented because most of the data is depicting a reality that is not truthful for the majority of the world's population. The majority of the world's population doesn't live in the Western world, is not educated, is not part of an industrialized country, is not rich, okay? And what is also sometimes missing from the output is diversity. And we see this, for example, when people use something like DALL-E in order to create an image, and the image is always depicting white people. So this leads us to the significance of developing AI literacy, our own AI literacy as educators, and also that of our students. And AI literacy basically means our ability as human beings to interact with the technology in a fruitful manner, knowing how to harness the technology to ultimately improve our everyday lives and society in general. Just as we learned how to use a calculator, just as we learned how to use a computer, we need to know how to use AI in order to ultimately progress as a species, as a society, and as individual professionals. And this AI literacy is fundamental. And there is a lot of literature currently on what it means and what the different dimensions of AI literacy consist of. What I'm going to be sharing with you now is a framework, one of many frameworks that have been developed in order to chart what these different competencies forming part of AI literacy consist of. So, for example, earlier at the beginning of my talk, I talked very much about understanding what AI is, how LLMs work, and what the nature consists of, what the limitations are. That is, if we look at the AI literacy framework developed by Hibbert, that is basically at a foundational level. It is basic AI literacy that we're talking about here. We're talking about knowledge. We're talking about an understanding of what these systems consist of, what the limitations might be. Once we start interacting with the technology and we start using it, and in order to do that, we require the competencies that I'm going to be talking about later, we are moving a step further. So we are now able to interact with generative AI and to apply it to a wide variety of tasks. A more important skill is something that I've already touched upon. The ability not only to use the technology, but to also do so in a critical manner. Hence, to analyze and evaluate its output, to understand the limitations of the model that you are currently using when compared to other models. And for some people, and for some of our students, and even members of the audience here today, there are other levels of AI literacy. This is the ability to ultimately harness the technology in such a way that you have a creative role in what you do with it. Some people are also able to tailor a specific model to the needs. And this is where our digital literacy is far more enhanced. For many of us, however, as educators and as students, the first 3 steps of this particular pyramid are the most important. They are vital. And today I'm going to be talking primarily about the second and the third steps, focusing mostly on the second one, because this is our starting point when it comes to interacting with the technology. Hibbert also came up with a number of reflection questions, and there are many reflection questions associated with each stage of the pyramid that make us think about our own AI literacy. So when we are thinking about an LLM, we have to think about what might the tool that we're currently using be particularly useful for. So this is perhaps an understanding of how one particular model might be more suitable for a specific task that we have in mind than another one. And realizing that a specific tool that we want to use might not be able to deliver the output that we have in mind, and hence we need to go to another tool. And there are many, many tools out there, many generative AI tools out there that we can ultimately use. And some of them are particularly useful for specific tasks. So when it comes to that basic level of AI literacy, knowing which tools are available and how we can use them is significant. Then we can move on to use and application. So here, when we're interacting with the generative AI model, what can we feed into it? What prompt should we be using? How can we adjust it in order to refine the output? And I'll be devoting a lot of attention to this particular stage in my talk today. When we move on to analysis and evaluation, we start thinking about the biases that might be inherent in the output and whether we need to change our prompt in order to avoid those biases. And later I'll be talking about something which has become even more important when we consider certain LLMs, newly developed LLMs. And finally, for people who have a higher level of AI literacy, and they might be developing their own AIs, perhaps for a company that they work for, or an institution or a school, then how can we design a better tool? A tool that meets specific needs, that allows us to achieve specific goals. Prompt engineering is crucial and is increasingly recognized as being a vital means by which we not only engage in interaction with AI, but it is also a means of stimulating deeper learning. So as educators, as language educators, if we develop an understanding of how to enable our students to use it more effectively, we are not only allowing our students to interact with the technology, but we can also develop a better understanding of whichever topics, issues, or tasks they are focusing on. And that is why there is literature that is currently being published on how we can merge the use of the technology with critical thinking. And in the process of synthesizing information that is derived from the use of the technology, we are also developing our students' ability to engage in critical thinking. And this leads us to the deep learning that Walter, in a paper published last year, is talking about. What is the value of prompt engineering? Well, we know that when we learn how to use the technology more effectively, then we are improving our accuracy in terms of the results that are generated by the technology. We also learn how to cut down on the time that perhaps we used to take in order to do certain tasks. So it can save us a lot of time. Many people sometimes give up when using an AI for a specific objective because they feel that it's not giving them exactly what they want. Perhaps the issue here is not that the AI is unable to do that, but perhaps it's because the interaction is failing to achieve clarity. So there is a lack of clarity of intent, and we are unable to communicate that clarity of intent to the AI. Prompt engineering, a more effective use of prompt engineering, facilitates complex tasks. It breaks down seemingly complex tasks into things that we can now do much more efficiently. It improves our experience as users of the technology, and ultimately it enables us to achieve better outcomes. So whichever tasks we might have in mind, we are now being more productive. We are now managing to do things better because we've learned how to better collaborate with the technology. And I'd like to underscore these words, interact and collaborate, because that is what some research is pointing out, that this is human-machine collaboration. And in order for this human-machine collaboration to be fruitful, we have a role to play in ultimately using this technology in a more efficient manner. So when we focus on prompt engineering, some of the things that we need to bear in mind are that it is language that we're using in order to communicate with the technology. Hence, we need to be clear in the message that we are relaying to it, the instructions that we're providing it with. So clarity in the language, but also clarity of intent. We ourselves need to be clear about what it is that we want to achieve and how best to communicate it when we write the prompts or speak the prompts that we feed into the technology. Conciseness is also described as being important. Relevance, so the information or the text that we feed into the AI has to be relevant to the goal that we have in mind. And we also need to remember that many of these generative AI tools, they are expecting us to engage in a conversation. So it's not a single prompt and that's it, but we build on one prompt after another. And that's why it's important that whenever you need to move on to a new task, you need to start a new conversation. You need to open a new window. And in that way, the model is following that conversation and allowing you to refine the output, to progressively refine the output. Some best practices that are most often mentioned have to do with specificity. So the prompt needs to ultimately give enough information to the model in order for the model to understand what it is that we desire. And hence, we might need to explain the context. For example, you wanted to do something for a particular job. Hence, what is the context of that job? Is it a company? What kind of company? What kind of role? These are things that are important in order for it to understand what it needs to produce. The format that you want it to generate. So, for example, many people, when they use ChatGPT, they feed it a prompt, and the output is most often in the format of bullet points, when in reality they didn't want bullet points. Hence, it's important to specify that you want the output to be in the format of coherent paragraphs. Okay, that might be what you have in mind. The length, so you also need to specify how long the output needs to be, and the tone and style, and also whether you want to tell it to make a distinction between something and another. So sometimes we not only give it a prompt, but we also upload certain documents, certain images even, in order for it to get better context and in order for it to replicate something that we have uploaded to it. Examples, hence, are important. These examples could be documents that we previously used and now we want a new version. They could be data that we wanted to incorporate into the output, certain templates that we have in mind. It could be even a referencing style that we ultimately wanted to follow, especially if it's not a referencing style that is widely available or that has been adapted. That is also important. It needs to know the parameters within which to actually work. We need to be as clear as possible about the output. We can't expect it to read our minds. So we need to be as specific as possible about the output that we desire, what we really want to achieve by means of it. And in certain cases, this might require multiple prompts, so a much longer conversation where we keep refining the output until we achieve what we have in mind. When providing instructions, sometimes we have to be careful not to be confusing in our use of language. So we have to be aware of the fact that potentially the negative can be confusing. And we also need to give the model a persona or frame of reference. So if I want to write a report, I need to tell the model from which perspective the report needs to be written, who the audience might be, and what my purpose is. And if the task that we wanted to do is highly complex, then it's better to split it up into simpler ones and then aggregate the different elements into one product. And ultimately, we need to understand that with any model that we might use, there are limitations. I'm not going to talk a lot about what these are, but for example, we need to understand that one of the limitations of many of the LLMs that we might be using is context window. So this is ultimately the ability of a model to process an amount of text that we feed it. So if we upload a very lengthy text, one specific model might not be able to remember what was at the beginning by the time it gets to the end. So that is an important thing. The context window is most often measured in tokens. These tokens can be as small as a character and as big as a word, depending on the language that is used, depending also on the format in which we feed information into the model. So context window is important. And if we look at the most popular models out there, for example, ChatGPT is far more limited than Gemini Advanced, when it comes to the context window. So that is something that we need to bear in mind if we are interacting with the LLM and uploading massive amounts of text or data. Another one is temperature. This setting is basically what controls the creativity of the output. In certain tasks, we don't want it to be very created, so the temperature setting has to be far, far lower. And guardrails. Guardrails are those constraints which limit what the LLM will produce. Now, these guardrails could be there to stop us from creating stuff that is illegal or that is unethical, or else it could be because the model has been trained in such a way that it stops us from asking the difficult questions, okay? So those of you who have used DeepSeek and might have asked DeepSeek for certain things that are uncomfortable for the people or the organization that designed that particular tool, then you know what these guardrails are. And there are ways of bypassing guardrails, but we need to be aware that different models have different kinds of guardrails in place. Now, moving on to the main focus of this talk, which is prompt engineering. Prompt methodologies, and there are many prompt methodologies that we can engage in when interacting with LLMs. These need to be, we need to have an awareness of the variety of methodologies that we can employ, because even though we might think that all prompts are the same, in reality, there are certain prompts that are far better, that give us a more privileged position than others. Let's start with the most basic one, the one that many of us employ. This is simple input-output prompting. So a brief prompt that asks for something out of the LLM, and obviously the output is going to be simple in nature. This is a classic example of how certain teachers interact with the model. So they ask the model to produce something to help them do something else, okay? What we notice here is a lack of context, a lack of background, a persona. There are many things that are missing from the prompt, and hence the model has to assume things about what we have in mind, how we're going to use this lesson plan, for whom we need it, and so on and so forth. There are many things that are missing, but if they had to be built into the prompt, perhaps the output would be far better. Chain of thought prompting is a methodology that allows us to interact with the technology in such a way that the model can explain how a response is generated. And here I have an example. So we're not just telling the AI what to do. We're not just telling it what we want it to create. And obviously the prompt here can be as detailed as we want it to be. But we're also asking it to provide us with the rationale behind each part of the lesson that is being designed. So we're asking it to ultimately explain its chain of thought, to provide us with a justification for the different stages of the lesson that we've asked it to create for us. And as you can see here, we're asking it for a lesson plan. But then besides the lesson plan, we could go into materials, we could go into so many different elements that constitute this particular lesson. But asking it to provide a rationale helps us also to understand whether the stages that it's come up with are useful for us or not, whether the rationale is sufficiently convincing or not. Then we move on to role play or expert prompting. So here we tell the AI to ultimately adopt a particular role. Now, as educators, we might want it to adopt our own role. And that's where we need to give it more information about who we are, what kind of educator we are, what kind of people we teach, what kind of role we have. We want it to ultimately adopt a position of expertise. And if we wanted to assume our role in the production of a specific task, then that expertise needs to be communicated to it. In certain methodologies, in fact, before you ask the AI to do something, first you provide it with a lot of information. So you might upload certain documents to it in order for it to get an understanding of the context, of the background from which to operate. And this is important. Let's imagine, for example, we want an explanation of a specific kind of cancer, but we don't want it to provide us with an explanation that we can easily read by going to Wikipedia. We want an explanation that is from the perspective of an oncologist. And hence, there, the information is far more technical in nature. It is information that is associated with a specific domain of expertise. Here I'm giving you an example. I'm showing you an example of how we might actually go about this particular methodology. So we are telling the AI that it's an English language teacher. We're asking it to prepare a lesson for upper intermediate students. We're giving it the topic. We're giving it the objective, okay? And then we're giving it a series of steps of how to go about the task. Here, the information I'm showing you is what fits on a slide. However, if we wanted to be more elaborate, we could do so. Always bearing in mind that whilst being elaborate, we also need to be concise and relevant in terms of the prompt that we feed into the AI. But we're ultimately telling the AI to design a lesson plan, but it has to meet specific stages. So there's an explanation of the concept, examples, common mistakes, a practice activity, and also to bear in mind assessment. We might even, if we wanted to, tell it what learning outcomes we have in mind. Or we might first start with the learning outcomes associated with reported speech for a particular CEFR level, and then move on to the design of an activity, and then another activity, and so on and so forth. So even breaking down a complex task into smaller tasks might ultimately lead to a far better outcome. The last methodology that I'm going to talk about is what we call self-consistency prompting. This is where we ultimately tell the AI that we wanted to generate different outputs and then to explain which one is best. So here we're asking it to ultimately be self-consistent in terms of its ability to think about what is more appropriate for us. So we can start with something as simple as this: generate 3 definitions of collocations and explain which one is best. It's a very simple prompt. This can be far more complex, but for the purpose of this exercise, let's keep it as simple as possible. Then the AI, in this case, I was using ChatGPT, it provided 3 different definitions. And in looking at them, what I'd like you to do is to use your own expertise, your own knowledge of the English language and your own knowledge of English language teaching to determine which one, according to you as professionals, is the best. So which one of these definitions might be the most appropriate. This is the second definition that was generated by ChatGPT. And this is the third. So here we have 3 definitions. And for us as professionals going through these definitions, we might immediately think of which one we consider to be the best for us. It's ultimately, it might be a subjective opinion, but obviously the deeper our knowledge of the language might be, we might gravitate towards one rather than another. But in this case, to complement our expertise, we're also asking the AI to give us an explanation of which one is best. And the way it went about this task is by actually providing us with an explanation of each one. So before telling us which one is best, it explains the merits of each one of the definitions it provided us with. So here we have the explanation for the first definition, the explanation for the second one, and the explanation for the third definition that it generated. And reading through these explanations, what we're bearing in mind here is which one is most convincing, obviously, knowing what we know about the English language and knowing what we know about collocations. And in reading these explanations, we might already think, I find one particular definition to be far more convincing, far more appropriate, given my knowledge of the language, than the others. But then we go to the next stage of the process. And in this stage, what we're doing is we're asking the technology to choose. So it generated 3 definitions, it generated 3 explanations, and now we're asking it to actually choose the best one. Whether the best definition is chosen by ChatGPT is the one we chose is up for question. But here we're also using our own critical thinking and our own knowledge of the language to determine whether the output, in this case, the output is its choice of what is the best definition and the explanation for why it is the best definition is correct or not. So this is where our own critical thinking as educators, our own knowledge of the language and our own knowledge of ELT comes into play. Rather than merely relying on what ChatGPT, through this multi-stage prompting process, determined to be the best definition and why, we need to ultimately use our own knowledge. Because if we merely go with definition 2 as being the best definition just because ChatGPT says so, then that is where we are offloading. We are basically shifting the cognitive load to the technology without using our own expertise to question whether this is the case or not. So if we had to sum up what are the most important elements when interacting with Gen AI, we can do so by looking at this particular model. First and foremost, we have to be very clear about our own goal. What is it that we want to achieve? Are we clear about the final output? What is the objective that we have in mind? Once we're clear about the objective, then we can start drafting an initial prompt. And the use of the word draft is important here, because when we use a prompt, it might not be the final version. We might need to keep refining the prompt depending on the output that is generated by the technology. So we draft an initial prompt, we test it, we evaluate the output, and here you can see the third stage of the pyramid I showed you earlier coming into play. We evaluate the output, and if we determine that it's not the desired output, that there is a mismatch between our goal and the output, then we need to refine the prompt further. And this iterative process is highly important when interacting with Gen AI. It's an iterative process, and we should avoid looking at the interaction with the technology as being made up of simple input-output prompting. So using a wider variety of prompt methodologies, and always bearing in mind that this is a conversation that we're having in order to eventually arrive at the objective that we have in mind is crucial. Now, prompt engineering has been discussed at length over the past 2 years or so, and there's a lot of buzz surrounding this particular competency. But as more of us become more proficient in our ability to use prompt engineering, and there are varying degrees of proficiency amongst educators and even amongst our students. However, we need to bear in mind that just because we might have developed a better understanding of how to use different prompt methodologies, there are other important skills, other important competencies that are coming into play. For example, in a recent Harvard Business Review article, the author talks about problem formulation. So the ability to really identify what the problem is before you arrive at an understanding of what the objective is. So most often we engage in tasks because we want to address a particular need, a particular issue, a challenge that we might have. Knowing what the problem actually consists of and being able to articulate what that problem is can enable us to achieve a better understanding of our goals and eventually employ different prompts in a more effective manner. And this ties in to the significance of other skills that we need to develop in ourselves as educators and also in our students. These are skills that in the past were described as 21st century skills, nowadays as global skills, but these are basically transversal competencies. These are competencies that enable us to achieve a wide variety of different things in the current educational context, but also in the society that we might live in. So they enable us to deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in a more productive manner. And knowing how to deploy these competencies together with our AI literacy is significant in order for us to ultimately be highly productive members of a team, of a community, and of society. That is all I had to share with you today. If you go to this QR link, you can download an article that develops what I said during this particular presentation in further detail and gives you an understanding of a broader range of prompt methodologies that you might want to ultimately use in your own professional work and also enable your students to learn about and to craft when interacting with AI. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.